She assumed it was just an ordinary anthill in her garden, but when the experts arrived and began to investigate the soil, they visibly paled and immediately instructed the woman to seek shelter indoors. What lay concealed beneath the earth was far more dreadful than she could have ever envisioned. Subscribe and share in the comments. Would you dare to peer into such a hill? Evelyn Johnson had been a resident of her humble abode on the outskirts of St. Martin Parish in Louisiana for close to 15 years. It was not a grand residence, merely a time-worn wooden dwelling with faded white paint that flaked at the edges, yet it was her own. She had received it from her late husband's family after his passing, and although at times it felt excessively spacious and too silent for a solitary woman and her aging canine, it had transformed into her refuge. The garden behind the house was her greatest joy, a vibrant mosaic of vegetables, flowers, and fruit-bearing shrubs that kept her engaged during the long, oppressive evenings when the atmosphere felt almost thick enough to consume. Cultivating her garden was not merely a pastime for her. It served as a balm for her soul after arduous shifts at the nearby clinic where she worked as a nurse, attending to individuals who often bore more emotional weight than their physical bodies could withstand. Out there, amidst the rows of tomatoes, peppers, beans, and the sweet perfume of blooms and magnolias, she could escape the exhaustion that weighed heavily on her shoulders and experience a connection to something enduring and alive. It was during one of those evenings, as the sun descended and painted the horizon with hues of gold, that she first observed a small mound of earth near the far boundary of her yard. It was situated close to the fence, where the soil was darker and more saturated from the runoff that trickled into the shallow ditch beyond. Initially, she paid it little mind, attributing its presence to the work of a mole burrowing underground, or perhaps a common anthill, which were prevalent in the area. Louisiana gardens frequently harbored ant colonies, especially during the summer, when the ground seemed to teem with unseen activity. She knelt to examine it more closely, gently brushing away a few blades of grass that had sprouted around the elevation. The soil appeared looser than usual, as though it had been recently excavated from below. Evelyn's brow furrowed slightly, but then she shrugged, rising to wipe her hands on her gardening gloves. There was no point in fretting over something so insignificant. The subsequent morning, however, upon her return with her watering can, she re-noticed the mound. This time it seemed slightly larger, its surface fractured and uneven, as if something within had been forcing its way upward. She bent down, pressing her fingers into the earth. It felt unusually soft, yielding more readily than she anticipated. A subtle, musty aroma emanated from it, earthy and damp, carrying the scent of the marshy regions she knew lay not far from her neighborhood. She straightened, removing her gloves, and muttered to herself that it must be an ant colony making its ascent. This was not uncommon, though she couldn't recall ever witnessing one grow so rapidly within a single day. Over the course of the following week, Evelyn grew increasingly aware of the mound's persistence. Each evening upon her return from the clinic, she found it larger. The surface soil appeared disturbed and churned, as if restless appendages had clawed at it from beneath. The modest pile had expanded from a lump the size of her fist to something resembling a miniature hill, approximately the width of a small wash basin. She crouched beside it, gently prodding it with a garden spade, and observed that the soil crumbled away easily, almost disintegrating into airy clods. What struck her most was its texture. It was not densely packed, as anthills typically were. Instead, it was perforated with tiny conduits, too narrow for her to see into, but suggestive of a subterranean maze. Still, she reassured herself not to worry. Having resided in Louisiana for a considerable time, she was aware that the land teemed with insects and creatures, most of whom kept to themselves unless provoked. She continued watering her rows of beans and tending to the wilting leaves of her tomatoes. Yet she found herself glancing back at the mound with each pass through the garden, as if it had developed an unsettling presence, a quiet inhabitant of her space demanding acknowledgement. Her dog, A shepherd mix with more silver than black around his muzzle seemed to notice it as well. One evening, as Evelyn was tending to her flower bed, she saw the dog standing a few yards from the mound, his ears erect and his body tense. He emitted a low growl, his tail held stiffly. Evelyn looked at him with surprise, then followed his gaze to the mound, which sat silent and unmoving in the dim light. "It's nothing," she said aloud, though she felt an unease hearing her own voice sound so dismissive. She whistled for the dog, and although he reluctantly joined her, he kept looking back as if wary of something he could perceive, but she could not. By the conclusion of the second week, the mound had doubled in size. It was now too significant to disregard, rising nearly to her knees, a bulging mass of earth that disrupted the uniform arrangement of her garden. Evelyn attempted to convince herself that it was merely an exceptionally active ant colony. She had read about fire ants constructing enormous mounds, though she had never encountered one of this magnitude in her own yard. However, there was something about the way the soil constantly shifted that made her pause. On some mornings, she could have sworn it appeared higher than it had been the previous night, and the grass surrounding it had begun to turn yellow, as if leached of its vitality. She recalled her grandmother's old proverbs about the earth, that the ground itself possessed life, and that at times it communicated through the signs it presented, if only one knew how to interpret them. Evelyn dismissed the thought, but the words lingered like a faint echo in the back of her mind. She did not subscribe to omens or superstitions. Nevertheless, as she stood gazing at the mound under the heavy, twilight sky, she felt a subtle stirring within her, a vague apprehension she couldn't quite define. That night, as the cicadas droned loudly from the trees and the dense air clung to her skin, she found herself awakening from sleep to an unfamiliar sound. It was faint, muffled, like the whisper of dry leaves being disturbed. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling through the magnolia branches outside her window. But when she held her breath and listened intently, she realized it originated from the direction of the garden. It wasn't a loud noise, not enough to fully alarm her, but it possessed a rhythm, a consistent shifting, as if something were moving beneath the ground. Evelyn sat up in bed, her heart accelerating. But after a considerable period, the sound subsided, leaving only the persistent drone of insects outdoors. She lay back down, staring into the darkness, unable to dislodge the image of the mound slowly ascending and descending as if it were breathing. The following morning she returned to the garden, and as expected, the mound had grown again. It was now accompanied by a smaller rise of earth a few feet away, subtle but distinct, like an offspring to the larger hill. Evelyn pressed her lips together, a sense of unease prickling the back of her neck. Perhaps it's time to address this, she mused, though she was still reluctant to admit it might be a genuine problem. She knelt and touched the soil again, feeling its peculiar looseness, and told herself she would handle it before it expanded further. For the time being, however, she tried to continue with her day, though the mound remained fixed in her thoughts. While attending to her patients at the clinic, dispensing prescriptions and applying bandages, her mind repeatedly drifted back to her garden. She could visualize the earth shifting silently, expanding in her absence. The image troubled her, but she suppressed it each time, determined not to let her imagination get the better of her. Yet, in the quiet of the evening, as she stood at her kitchen window looking out over her yard, she felt a chill despite the heat. The mound sat there like an unwelcome guest, patient and persistent, growing according to its own secret cadence. Evelyn could not have foreseen then that the quiet elevation of Earth would soon herald the beginning of something that would irrevocably alter her existence. The days that followed her discovery of the second smaller rise in the soil unsettled Evelyn more than she cared to acknowledge. The mound had become an ever-present feature in her life, as if it were not simply a natural phenomenon, but an entity in its own right, a silent presence that drew her gaze every time she ventured outdoors. Her dog now completely avoided the area. He maintained a wide berth, occasionally pausing to emit a low growl, the fur along his back bristling as if cautioning her against something she herself refused to recognize. Evelyn found herself chuckling nervously at him, speaking aloud in the heavy stillness of her yard to reassure both herself and the animal that it was merely earth and insects, nothing more sinister. But her own words lacked conviction. The mound continued to expand, and feigning ignorance no longer eased her anxiety. Initially, she resolved to confront the issue, using the straightforward, practical methods she had observed her neighbors employ whenever ants or burrowing animals caused trouble in their lawns. She dragged the garden hose across the yard, uncoiling it with a determined flick of her wrist. The summer heat was already oppressive, sweat beading on her brow as she adjusted the metal nozzle and watched water arc through the air, glinting in the sunlight before splashing onto the mound. At first, the soil turned dark and slick, but she quickly noticed that the water did not behave as expected. Instead, it vanished almost instantaneously, absorbed into the earth with a faint hiss. It was as though the ground beneath the mound drank thirstily, consuming gallons without resistance. She continued the flow of water, biting her lip as the surface of the soil collapsed inward, creating small sinkholes. Yet, no matter how long she sprayed, the mound refused to erode. It seemed instead to absorb the deluge as parched lips absorb cool water. When she finally turned off the hose, panting in the heat, the mound appeared damp and partially collapsed. But by the following morning, it seemed not weakened, but strangely solidified, the soil packed more densely and standing taller than before. She tried again the next evening, this time with greater force. She plunged the nozzle of the hose directly into the apex of the mound, forcing water deep within. The earth yielded readily, caving into airy chambers beneath. She knelt closer, peering into the opening, and thought she detected a foul odor wafting upward, a musty organic scent, reminiscent of decaying foliage mingled with something more acrid. She gagged softly and recoiled, but compelled herself to continue spraying. The water gurgled and disappeared into unseen cavities, and she realized, with a sharp pang of dread, that the mound was not a simple accumulation of dirt, but part of a hollow network, a labyrinth concealed beneath her garden. She eventually withdrew, shutting off the hose, and stood observing the darkened earth until the evening light faded. By the next day, the mound had dried, the soil surface hardened and cracked, and it had visibly increased in height once more. She cursed under her breath, a rare sound escaping her lips. The feeling of helplessness settled like a stone in her chest. She could not bear the thought of something encroaching upon her garden, this one place where she felt a sense of control and solace. Thus, she decided to intensify her efforts. She retrieved her spade, a well-worn tool with a wooden handle smoothed by years of labor, and plunged it into the mound. The soil gave way with alarming ease. It was loose, airy, riddled with voids. She dug deeper, pushing further, and with each stroke of the blade, the ground seemed to collapse more rapidly, as if it had been undermined far below the surface. She scooped up a shovel full of earth and discovered it was permeated with fine holes. Hundreds of tiny passageways threaded through it like veins. She crouched lower, attempting to discern what might lie beneath, but only darkness met her gaze. The silence unnerved her, as she expected to see ants swarming furiously after being disturbed. Yet initially, there was nothing but stillness, as if the colony below held its breath. She stepped back, wiping sweat and soil from her brow, when a faint tremor passed through the mound. The surface seemed to tremble imperceptibly, and she dropped the spade with a sharp gasp. That night she barely slept. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with the vision of hollow tunnels beneath her feet, stretching endlessly like the skeletal remains of some colossal entity buried within the earth. She awoke frequently, hearing sounds she couldn't identify, a distant rustling, a muffled vibration, always emanating from the yard. When dawn broke, she stepped outside with her coffee and froze at the sight before her. The mound stood taller than ever, broader at its base, and beside it, 2 new elevations had emerged. Smaller, yes, but undeniable. They seemed to have sprouted overnight like mushrooms after a rain. Evelyn pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around the mug until it burned her palms. She had battled with water and steel, yet the mounds had multiplied. Still, she refused to surrender. On her way home from work, she stopped at the hardware store and purchased a container of powdered insecticide, the kind specifically marketed as effective against all types of ants. She returned to the garden at twilight, scattering the white granules across the surface of the mound, ensuring they dusted the openings and crevices. She sprinkled them on the smaller rises as well, her hands trembling despite her effort to remain composed. The powder gleamed faintly in the fading light, like frost clinging to the dark earth. Satisfied, she stepped back, brushing her hands together. Surely this would put an end to it. Surely by morning the colony would weaken and collapse. But her hope dissipated almost immediately. Within minutes of the powder settling, movement commenced. The soil quivered, shifted, and then a surge of insects erupted from the openings. At first, they appeared no different from ordinary ants, small, red-brown bodies scurrying furiously across the surface. But they emerged in such vast numbers that the earth itself seemed to crawl. They swarmed over the powder, carrying it away, scattering it as if it were no more than dust in their path. Their movement was frenzied, purposeful, and Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized they were not deterred, but agitated. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the hose coiled at her feet, her heart pounding as she watched the ground swell. The sight instilled in her a profound, primal dread. That night, the noises intensified. From her bed, she heard the distinct rustling of countless tiny bodies shifting beneath the earth. The sound reminded her of dry paper being slowly torn repeatedly, or of heavy fabric being dragged across a floor. The dog refused to enter the house, pacing restlessly at the back door, emitting a low, mournful whine. Evelyn lay awake, gazing at the ceiling, her skin prickling with unease. The weight of her helplessness pressed down harder than ever. She had tried water, she had tried digging, she had tried poison, and all had failed. Worse, her efforts seemed only to provoke the hidden colony into greater activity. In the early morning hours, when the air was thick with mist and the world was still cloaked in gray, she rose and stepped barefoot to the back door. Through the glass, she could see the mounds, their shapes looming like shadows in the pale light. The largest had expanded, its surface cracked open to reveal deeper cavities. The 2 smaller mounds had swollen, nearly matching the first, and beyond them, scattered across the yard, she thought she could discern yet more faint rises, as if the infestation were spreading unchecked, multiplying beneath her very feet. She placed a hand against the doorframe, her breath shuddering out of her lungs. Evelyn had never been a woman prone to panic, She had raised children, cared for ailing relatives, endured lengthy shifts at the clinic where emergencies were constant, and composure was a necessity. But now, in the quiet dawn, she experienced a rare and overwhelming fear. Her attempts to assert dominion over the land had utterly failed. Whatever force resided beneath the soil was stronger, more numerous, more relentless than she had imagined. It was not merely an inconvenience, it was a menace. She could no longer convince herself that she was dealing with ordinary ants. She could no longer ignore the way the ground seemed alive, swelling and pulsing with an unseen rhythm. As the sun began to ascend, casting its light across her yard, Evelyn made her decision. She could not confront this alone. She could not allow her stubborn pride to continue blinding her. Her garden, her sanctuary, had transformed into a place of danger, and her safety was at stake. She would seek assistance. She would enlist the help of those with the expertise and equipment she lacked. Yet, even as she resolved to make the call, she could not shake the heavy sensation in her chest, the intuition that whatever dwelled beneath the soil was far beyond anything ordinary pest control had ever encountered. And as she turned away from the window, her gaze lingering on the restless silhouette of the mounds one final time, She felt the creeping certainty that she had already waited too long. The decision to seek help lingered in Evelyn's mind throughout the night that followed her latest futile attempt to combat the infestation. She had remained awake again, listening to the restless hum that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath her garden. It was louder now, unmistakable, a kind of whispering vibration that occasionally swelled to such an extent that the floorboards of her bedroom appeared to tremble subtly. By morning, her nerves were frayed, her eyes red from lack of sleep, yet she still rose as she always did, put on her slippers, and went to the back door to look outside. What she beheld caused her stomach to clench into a tight knot. The single, large mound had evolved into a broad, irregular hill that spanned the corner of the yard, but it was no longer solitary. All around it, scattered at irregular intervals, new mounds had appeared. They were smaller, but unmistakably of the same nature, their surfaces cracked and disturbed, as if something beneath had churned violently during the night. Evelyn counted at least a dozen, some no larger than her shoe, others already reaching her knees. They were spreading outward in every direction, encroaching upon her flower beds, her vegetable rows, even approaching the patio where she occasionally sat in the evenings. It was as though the ground itself had become afflicted, and the infestation was steadily advancing toward her home. Her dog stood rigidly on the porch, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He refused to descend onto the grass, his ears pinned back and his tail rigid. Evelyn glanced down at him and saw in his tense posture a reflection of her own unvoiced fear. Animals often sense danger long before humans acknowledged it, and she had no doubt now that whatever inhabited the soil beneath was more than a mere nuisance. It was a presence that disturbed the very atmosphere around it. Mustering what courage she could, Evelyn stepped off the porch and approached the largest mound. The morning sun slanted across the yard, casting deep shadows within the fissures that marred its surface. She knelt cautiously, leaning in closely, and observed the earth shifting imperceptibly, rising and falling as if it were breathing. A shiver coursed through her body, and she instinctively reached for the spade she had left partially embedded in the ground nearby. With slow, deliberate movements, she prodded the mound, the tip of the spade sinking effortlessly into the loose soil. The instant the earth was disturbed, the surface seemed to ripple. Fine particles of soil crumbled away, and then a faint, scraping noise emanated from within. Evelyn recoiled, her heart pounding erratically, and in that very instant, a cluster of insects erupted from one of the fissures. They were indeed ants, yet dissimilar to the minuscule black ones that frequented kitchens, or the crimson variants she had encountered biting at ankles during leisurely outdoor gatherings. These were considerably larger, their exoskeletons a deep, ruddy brown that shimmered under the sun's rays, their jaws sharp and perpetually in motion. They advanced with a disquieting uniformity, flowing from the aperture in a circular formation, cascading over the earthen mound and onto the verdant lawn. Evelyn stumbled backward, clutching the gardening tool as if it were a defensive implement, but the insects did not pursue her for any significant distance. They dispersed across the surface of the mound, exhibiting agitation, carrying small clods of earth in their mandibles, and hurrying back into the openings. This was not a chaotic melee, but rather a meticulously orchestrated response, as if her disturbance had precipitated some form of protective protocol. Observing their synchronized activity, a shiver of recognition coursed through her. This was not merely a collection of insects. It represented a colossal, sentient mechanism composed of countless, minuscule components. She fled back towards the veranda, her breathing ragged, and ushered her canine companion inside with her. From the vantage point of the kitchen window, she continued her observation, pressing the flats of her hands against the countertop for stability. The ants once more disappeared beneath the earth's surface, yet the mounds persisted in their subtle quaking, faint tremors causing small avalanches of soil to descend their inclines. She could not dispel the growing conviction that the ground beneath her residence was hollow, riddled with a network of subterranean passages, extending far beyond the confines of her property. Later that day, as she attempted to occupy herself with household tasks, Evelyn noticed an even more disturbing development. The vegetation situated closest to the mounds was exhibiting signs of decay. Her tomato plants, once robust and vibrantly green, now drooped listlessly, their leaves curling and yellowing despite her diligent watering efforts. The bean plants sagged against their supporting stakes, and the marigolds she had planted to create a cheerful border had lost their luminescence. Kneeling to examine the soil near the plant roots, she discovered it to be inexplicably dry and crumbly, as though all moisture had been leached away. The realization dawned upon her gradually but inexorably. Whatever entity resided below was siphoning the very vitality from the earth, sustenance that nourished the ground, leaving the surface desolate. By the second evening, her apprehension had escalated into profound dread. The nocturnal sounds were no longer faint but insistent, a restless rustling that seemed to permeate the entirety of the yard. On a couple of occasions, she distinctly felt her bed vibrate faintly, as though the unseen subterranean network were expanding, reconfiguring itself. She remained propped upright for extended periods, clutching a flashlight, though she understood that no beam of light could penetrate the soil to reveal the hidden inhabitants. Her dog lay at her feet, emitting soft whines, and refused to leave her side. The following morning, she cautiously tested the ground with her steps, venturing only far enough to ascertain that the infestation had progressed further. New mounds now dotted the far expanse of the yard, closer to the vegetable patch, forming a disquieting constellation that expanded incrementally with each passing day. She contemplated the neighbors residing beyond the fence, and pondered whether the subterranean tunnel system had already extended beneath their properties, unseen. The notion of its unchecked proliferation filled her with a sickening form of terror. In a final, desperate bid to regain a semblance of control, Evelyn retrieved the container of insecticide powder she had purchased and liberally distributed it across the newly formed mounds. This time, the reaction was immediate and formidable. Ants surged from the earth in a cascading torrent, swarming over her footwear and ascending the fabric of her trousers. She cried out and recoiled, swatting at her ankles, her heart pounding as the insects swarmed in synchronized waves. She retreated to the perceived safety of the porch, trembling with shock, and observed as they meticulously carried away the powder, granule by granule, neutralizing her efforts with unnerving precision. It was not merely that the poison had proven ineffective, it was the apparent adaptation of the colony, as though they had foreseen her actions and devised countermeasures. Evelyn retreated indoors, drawing the curtains tightly shut, though daylight still filtered through the minute gaps. She sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as they clasped a cooling mug of coffee, and finally conceded what she had been resisting for an extended duration. This was no ordinary predicament, no common household annoyance that she could resolve with her tools and sheer determination. She had exhausted every known recourse, and all had proven futile. The infestation was accelerating its spread, feeding on her soil, growing bolder with every passing hour. The apprehension that had gnawed at her quietly in the initial stages now surged openly within her chest, undeniable and all-consuming. As twilight descended and the subterranean vibrations beneath her dwelling intensified, Evelyn understood that she could no longer postpone the inevitable. She would be compelled to seek assistance without delay. Yet even as she reached for the telephone, she could not shake the profound certainty that any professional summoned to investigate would uncover something far more alarming than she herself could possibly conceive. The alterations in her garden were not merely unsettling. They served as a stark warning, and she harbored a deep-seated fear that it was already irrevocably too late. Evelyn had foregone her morning meal. The uneaten plate of eggs had long since cooled and solidified on the table, yet she barely registered it. Her hands lay intertwined, fingers clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she stared intently at the small display of her mobile device, as if willing it to initiate the call independently. Throughout the protracted night, she had been subjected to the unsettling cacophony originating from beneath her yard. The incessant shifting, the subtle tearing sound, as if the very earth were being ripped asunder. The peculiar sensation that the ground itself surrounding her domicile was sentient. She had awakened from disquieting dreams on multiple occasions, her heart hammering against her ribs, convinced that she had felt the floorboards subtly reverberate, as if the entire structure were caught within the languid respiration of some colossal entity buried deep below. Now, in the muted light of dawn, she could no longer defer the decision. Her endeavors had proven unsuccessful. Her garden was succumbing, the infestation was actively expanding, her very safety was compromised. The telephone felt ponderous in her grasp as she finally raised it and keyed in the number for the local pest control service. She had committed it to memory the previous evening but had hesitated, foolishly clinging to the hope that the morning light would reveal a less dire situation, that perhaps her exhaustion had led her to exaggerate. However, upon drawing back the curtains moments earlier, the sight that greeted her had robbed her of breath. The largest mound had extended outward like a burgeoning tide, its magnitude now triple what it had been mere days prior. Surrounding it, the smaller mounds had proliferated anew. Where yesterday she had estimated approximately a dozen, there were now considerably more, some merely low elevations in the grass, while others were rapidly swelling into new hillocks. They encroached upon the patio, the flower beds, and even the base of the steps leading to her veranda. The earth in their vicinity was disturbed, fractured, and mobile, as if permeated by unseen voids. It resembled less a garden now, and more the topography of an alien world, scarred and unsettled. When the connection was established, a composed female voice responded, inquiring about the nature of her needs. Evelyn attempted to articulate her situation, her words faltering in her urgency. She spoke of mounds, of soil that absorbed water without yielding, of peculiar vibrations and nocturnal sounds, of insects of extraordinary size and aggression, unlike any she had previously encountered. A brief silence ensued on the other end before the voice replied with measured equanimity, inquiring whether she was certain these were not simply fire ants, which, while common and hazardous, were not an unusual occurrence in the region. Evelyn insisted, her voice escalating, that this was a distinctly different phenomenon, something more menacing, that the infestation was rapidly engulfing her entire yard within a matter of days. She could discern the skepticism in the operator's tone, could almost visualize a raised eyebrow, a subtle smirk reserved for individuals prone to overstatement. Nevertheless, desperation imbued her with strength, and she implored them to dispatch personnel with utmost expediency, to send a team that very day, ideally that morning. Finally, the operator assured her that someone would be dispatched within the ensuing 24 hours. This assurance, however, was insufficient to quell Evelyn's pounding heart. Yet she accepted it, offered her gratitude, and concluded the call. The telephone slipped from her trembling fingers, landing with a dull thud upon the table. She covered her face with her hands, inhaling long, shaky breaths. It was done. She had summoned assistance. She was no longer capable of managing this crisis independently. Yet, even as a faint flicker of relief ignited within her, dread swiftly extinguished it. She could not dislodge the image of the shifting, proliferating, seemingly breathing soil, and she harbored the disquieting premonition that by the time the specialists arrived, it would have progressed far beyond salvage. The remainder of the day unfolded in a state of heightened tension. Evelyn attempted to resume her domestic duties, but each task was interrupted by an incessant urge to gaze outward. Each time she surveyed the scene, she perceived the mounds to be larger, though definitive confirmation was elusive. She observed her dog pacing restlessly from one window to another, whining audibly when he caught sight of the garden, his body rigid with apprehension. She was no longer able to entice him outdoors, not even for his basic needs. As dusk settled, the nocturnal sounds recommenced with amplified intensity. She sat in her living room with all the lights extinguished, a flashlight clutched in her lap, the curtains drawn tightly across the windows. Nevertheless, the sounds penetrated the walls regardless, the muffled crackling of shifting earth, the faint hum akin to a chorus of unseen voices. At times, a vibration resonated beneath her feet, so steady and profound it seemed to echo within her very bones. Sleep proved unattainable. She moved from one chair to another, from room to room, perpetually listening, perpetually experiencing the sensation that the ground itself might fracture. At one juncture in the early hours of the morning, she thought she perceived movement beyond her window, a ripple across the lawn, as if the very earth were undulating beneath an imperceptible wave. Her throat constricted with terror. She drew the curtain shut once more and pressed her back against the wall, her heart pounding ferociously. When dawn finally broke again, Evelyn was utterly exhausted, but resolute. She stepped cautiously onto her porch, the air thick with humidity, the sky a pale hue of early light. Her dog followed reluctantly, remaining close to her legs, his head lowered. She surveyed the yard and nearly gasped. The largest mound had grown monstrous, approaching her waist in height. Its surface had cracked open like a fractured shell, revealing dark cavities within. The smaller mounds had swollen significantly overnight, rising in irregular clusters, and additional ones were now visible along the far edge of the yard, near the fence. She could discern the thinning grass situated between them. The soil appeared cracked and pallid, and in certain locations the earth seemed to subside, creating shallow depressions. As she stood observing, the ground directly beneath the nearest mound visibly shifted, precipitating a cascade of loose soil down its side. A sudden eruption of ants poured forth, a churning, reddish-brown torrent that spread across the ground with coordinated movement. Evelyn stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. They did not advance toward her, but their sheer multitude caused her head to swim. They moved with the singular purpose of a unified organism, each individual driven by the same relentless imperative. She turned and hurried back indoors, slamming the door and securing the lock as if a simple latch could effectively repel them. By mid-morning, she was pacing her kitchen, her gaze flicking to the windows at frequent intervals. Her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Each time she peered outside, the mounds seemed to loom larger, closer. She envisioned the network of tunnels extending beneath her house, beneath her very feet, undermining the foundational structure. She pressed her palms against the countertop to steady herself, whispering aloud that the experts would arrive, that they had given their word, that she only needed to wait. However, patience was an impossibility when every sound suggested a harbinger of danger, every tremor a premonition of collapse. When the telephone finally rang, she nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. The same composed voice informed her that a team had been dispatched and was en route, with an estimated arrival time within the next hour. A paradoxical blend of relief and terror surged through her chest. She was grateful for their imminent arrival, yet a part of her dreaded what they might discover, what they might confirm regarding the nightmare unfolding beneath her soil. She expressed her gratitude again, her voice quivering, and terminated the call. Then she sat by the window, her gaze fixed upon the advancing mounds, her heart thudding in rhythm with the imperceptible vibrations emanating from below. She experienced no sense of triumph, no feeling of victory for having finally sought assistance. Instead, she felt akin to a woman seated within a besieged stronghold, awaiting rescuers who might already be too late. As the minutes elongated and the subterranean sounds intensified, Evelyn realized that her garden, once her sanctuary and source of pride, had transformed into an alien landscape she no longer recognized. The soil was no longer merely soil. It had become a delicate veil stretched taut over something vast and insatiable, something that had claimed her home as its territory. All she could do now was wait, acutely aware that each passing moment of delay allowed the infestation to deepen, widen, and strengthen. The urgent call she had placed was not merely a plea for aid, it was an admission of profound defeat, and though she could not yet grasp it, the arrival of the specialists would signify not the cessation of her terror, but its true inception. When the pristine white van navigated the narrow gravel roadway and subsequently entered her driveway, Evelyn was already positioned at the window, observing with eyes that had not experienced more than a few minutes of sleep over the preceding 2 nights. Her posture was taut with anticipation, her shoulders rigid, her breath caught in her throat. The dog at her side emitted a sharp bark upon glimpsing the approaching strangers, but his tone lacked the carefree exuberance he once reserved for guests. Instead, it conveyed a low undercurrent of unease, as if he too sensed that the van heralded not solace, but the confirmation of something dire. Evelyn placed a hand upon his head to soothe him, though her own pulse accelerated as the men disembarked. There were 3 of them, attired in khaki uniforms adorned with the company emblem embroidered above their shirt pockets. They carried cases of equipment and conversed amongst themselves in hushed tones, their gestures brisk and businesslike. Evelyn compelled herself to inhale and open the door, stepping onto the porch as they approached. The morning air was heavy with humidity, and the mounds in her yard loomed in the distance like a cluster of malignant growths proliferating from the earth. She observed the specialists' gazes drift toward them, their expressions transitioning from casual indifference to cautious curiosity. "You must be Miss Johnson," the man in the lead stated as he ascended the steps, extending his hand. He was tall, with thinning hair and the composed, weathered countenance of an individual who had dedicated years to fieldwork. "I'm Richard. This is Paul, and that's Kevin. You mentioned a substantial infestation. We're here to conduct an assessment." Evelyn clasped his hand briefly, her fingers feeling cold and clammy despite the ambient heat. "It's considerably more severe than I could convey over the telephone," she stated. Her voice sounded unfamiliar to her own ears, thin and strained. She gestured toward the garden. "Please, you will witness it firsthand." They followed her into the yard, their boots crunching on the brittle grass. Initially, they proceeded with professional detachment, but the moment they reached the periphery of the nearest mound, their composure faltered. Evelyn observed it, in the widening of Richard's eyes, the uneasy shifting of Paul's stance, the indistinct utterance from Kevin. The primary mound now stood at waist height, its surface fractured and mobile, and surrounding it, the smaller mounds had expanded like malevolent offspring. The soil between them subsided into shallow depressions, suggesting hollowness beneath, and faint vibrations transmitted through the ground with each footfall. "Good heavens," Richard whispered. He crouched near the edge of the mound, his gloved hand tracing the soil. It yielded under his touch, disintegrating into loose granules. He withdrew his hand swiftly, brushing it clean, and turned to his companions. "Retrieve the equipment." Paul and Kevin hurried back to the van, returning with cases of instruments that Evelyn had never before encountered. They unpacked a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, assembling it with swift, practiced movements. Evelyn hovered nearby, wringing her hands, observing as they maneuvered the sensor across the soil and scrutinized the monitor. The screen emitted a soft glow in the morning light, casting their faces in a pale blue luminescence. Richard leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. Evelyn edged nearer, peering over his shoulder. What she witnessed caused her stomach to lurch. On the display, depicting the subterranean landscape beneath her garden, was an intricate labyrinth of passages. They extended in every direction like veins coursing through flesh, twisting and converging, a sprawling network that appeared to reach far beyond the boundaries of her property. Some tunnels were slender, resembling pencil lines etched in shadow, but others were broad, cavernous voids that suggested chambers capable of accommodating thousands of insects. The sheer magnitude of it was overwhelming. "It's colossal," Kevin murmured, his voice laced with disbelief. He indicated the screen. "Observe its extent. I have never encountered anything of this nature." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is not merely a nest. This is an entire system. There could be millions of them down there." He straightened abruptly, surveying the yard with sharp, appraising eyes. "We must proceed with caution," Evelyn's knees weakened, and she grasped the porch railing for support. "I informed you," she whispered. "I told you this was not normal." Richard turned to her, his face pale but steady. "Miss Johnson, I require you to go inside. Secure the doors. Remain away from the windows. We will continue our examination, but it may not be safe for you to remain out here." His tone brooked no dissent. Evelyn nodded hastily, retreating back towards the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She paused at the threshold, glancing over her shoulder just as the radar unit emitted a faint beep. The screen flared with increased brilliance, the depicted shapes shifting as the sensors penetrated deeper. Richard leaned in, then visibly stiffened, his face drained of all color. He barked something to his colleagues that Evelyn could not discern, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Both men froze, then recoiled from the mound as if it were poised to detonate. Evelyn's breath hitched. For a protracted moment, she remained frozen at the entryway, torn between the impulse to stay and the instinct to flee. Then Richard turned sharply toward her, his voice carrying across the yard. "Inside, now! Do not hesitate! Get inside immediately!" The authority in his command galvanized her into action. She yanked the door open and slammed it shut behind her, fumbling with the lock as her dog whined and barked beside her. She pressed her back against the door, panting, her entire body trembling. Through the window, she could observe the men retreating toward the van, their equipment abandoned near the mound. Their countenances were grim, their movements swift and deliberate. They were afraid. Within the perceived sanctuary of her kitchen, Evelyn sank into a chair, her heart racing. Fear coiled in her stomach, heavy and cold. The specialists had arrived, precisely as she had implored. But their reaction validated her most profound anxieties. This was not an infestation that could be readily managed with powder or poison. This was something of greater magnitude, something sufficiently perilous to cause seasoned professionals to blanch and withdraw. The certainty of that truth bore down upon her, suffocating in its immensity. Minutes elapsed, or perhaps hours. She could not ascertain the duration. Time seemed to lose its conventional significance as she remained in silent contemplation, intermittently discerning the muffled sounds of movement. Occasionally, she detected Richard's voice, clipped and urgent, as he communicated via radio. The others moved with haste, their footsteps heavy upon the porch as they collected the equipment they could carry. She couldn't resist a quick glance through the window coverings and observed them clustered near the transport, engaged in hushed, urgent conversation. Richard, his brow furrowed with concern, pointed towards the dwelling before turning his gaze back to the earthworks. From inside, Evelyn felt a familiar, subtle vibration once more, a tremor that coursed through her feet and into her very being. It was akin to resting atop a colossal, ceaseless mechanism. Clutching herself, she swayed gently in her seat, murmuring long-forgotten supplications. Her thoughts drifted to her once vibrant, flourishing garden, now a stark contrast to the dark, exposed labyrinth unearthed beneath it. The disparity was agonizing. Finally, a firm, though not frantic, rapping sounded at her door. Evelyn, her legs unsteady, rose and opened it just enough to reveal Richard's face. He appeared aged somehow, the lines of worry deeply carved around his eyes. "We've secured additional assistance," he conveyed softly. "This is beyond our expertise. Specialists, along with animal control personnel, are en route. Until they arrive, you must remain indoors. Do not approach the yard. Do you comprehend?" Evelyn could only offer a silent nod, her throat too constricted to form words. He offered a brief, understanding look before turning and hurrying back to his team. The van doors clanged shut, and the engine ignited with a roar. They remained. She grasped that they were awaiting reinforcements, positioned to observe while further aid was summoned. Yet the drone of the idling engine filled the atmosphere like a nervous pulse. Evelyn closed the door again, carefully securing the lock. She pressed herself against it, eyes shut, and felt the heavy weight of her powerlessness descend. The experts had arrived, and even they had shown apprehension. Whatever resided beneath her soil was not merely a nuisance, but a formidable entity capable of unsettling seasoned professionals. Placing her palms flat against the wood, she felt the faint undulations that still permeated the ground and seeped into her home, and she knew with a chilling certainty that her existence had irrevocably entered uncharted territory. The atmosphere surrounding Evelyn's residence grew increasingly oppressive as the hours advanced. The presence of the specialists offered no solace. Their transport idled at the conclusion of her driveway, its engine a low hum beneath the rising chorus of cicadas accompanying the day's warmth. Peering through gaps in her drapes, she observed them pacing, conversing into radios, and occasionally casting uneasy glances towards the earth mounds. Their expressions confirmed that the information displayed on their monitors had profoundly disturbed them. Initially, they attempted to conceal their unease, employing terse professional language, but the reality proved uncontainable. This was no ordinary infestation, no problem solvable with common treatments. It was something far more significant. A living, expanding entity beneath her very property, potent enough to compel men accustomed to managing such crises to withdraw and summon further assistance. By mid-afternoon, additional vehicles began to appear. The first was a dark utility vehicle bearing state insignia, followed by a truck laden with unfamiliar equipment. Men in uniform disembarked, some carrying cases, others shouldering substantial packs. They exchanged no pleasantries, their demeanor characterized by the tense efficiency of those responding to an emergency. Evelyn, observing through the narrow aperture of her curtains, watched them spread out across the yard, assessing the situation. The earthworks appeared more substantial than they had that morning, their surfaces fissured like volcanic rock, the soil shifting as if agitated from below by unseen currents. One official, a woman attired in a dark green uniform, stooped to examine the ground near the largest mound. Adorned with heavy gloves and protective eyewear, her movements were precise and deliberate. Evelyn could not discern her words, but she witnessed Richard step forward and reply, indicating the equipment they had previously set aside. The officials conferred with grave nods, and more personnel began unloading additional apparatus from their vehicles. Soon, the yard was dotted with an array of unusual instruments, radar scanners, thermal imagers, and substantial metallic cylinders reflecting the sunlight. Her dog suddenly emitted a deep, agitated bark, prompting Evelyn to pull him away from the window. Her own heart pounded in her ears. She could observe the concentrated expressions of the personnel as they analyzed the readings, and she recognized from the set of their jaws and the tension in their voices that the circumstances were more dire than anticipated. She couldn't help but envision the subterranean passages extending endlessly, connecting chambers teeming with a dense population. The thought of the ground giving way beneath her, her house succumbing to a living mass of insects, made her stomach churn and her palms perspire. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, one of the officials approached her porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered visage and an authoritative bearing. When she opened the door a cautious inch, he spoke with unwavering firmness. "Ma'am, we require you to stay inside your residence. This situation presents a significant hazard. We have engaged additional agencies for containment. Until we receive clearance, you must not venture outdoors under any circumstances. Do you understand?" Evelyn offered another mute nod, her throat parched, her lips stiff. The man acknowledged her with a sharp nod before returning to his colleagues. She closed the door once more, resting her forehead against the cool wood. She felt like a captive in her own home, ensnared by the unseen force that had emerged from beneath her garden. Night descended, accompanied by a symphony of sounds that sent shivers down her spine. From all directions came the restless scuttling of subterranean movement. At times, it surged with sudden intensity, like waves crashing against a shore, only to recede into a low hum. The house's floor vibrated subtly, consistently enough to agitate the dishes in her cupboards. Evelyn remained in her darkened kitchen, every light extinguished, listening in terror. Through the walls, she caught fragmented echoes of voices, crackling radios, and the crunch of boots on gravel. The officials remained on watch, but their presence did little to assuage her fear. If anything, the gravity of their deployment amplified her dread. Around midnight, a sudden flurry of activity erupted outside. Shouts echoed. Equipment was rapidly moved across the yard, and powerful floodlights illuminated the earthworks in stark white beams. Evelyn, despite her apprehension, rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to observe. What she saw stole her breath. The largest mound had ruptured, its sides splitting open in a jagged chasm. From within cascaded an unholy multitude of ants, millions upon millions, their exoskeletons gleaming as they poured forth in an unending torrent. The floodlights caught their motion, transforming the overwhelming tide into a nightmarish spectacle of writhing forms. The officials reacted instantly, deploying sprayers that released clouds of white mist, but the swarm resisted, surging outwards, only to suddenly retreat back into the fissure as if directed by an unseen command. Evelyn covered her mouth to stifle a cry. Her dog whimpered by her side, pressing close to her legs. She stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering, struggling to breathe. These were not simply insects reacting randomly. They moved with deliberate intent, advancing and retreating in coordinated waves, their sheer numbers making the very ground appear animate. She had believed herself prepared for any eventuality, but the sight of that deluge defied simple comprehension. The commotion outside persisted. She heard the rumble of engines as more equipment was brought in, the clatter of metal as heavy containers were positioned, and the steady cadence of commands and clipped voices. Occasionally, she heard muffled thuds, suggesting the deployment of explosive charges deep within the soil, followed by the acrid aroma of chemicals drifting through her windows. Yet, the subterranean sounds persisted. The vibrations continued, tireless and relentless, as though the colony beneath her yard extended further than any of them had envisioned. By dawn, she was gaunt, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She returned to the window and saw that the mounds were now blackened and scarred from the night's engagement, their surfaces coated in peculiar residues. Nevertheless, they remained, towering higher than any ordinary nest had a right to, their bases spreading wider across the yard. The surrounding grass was withered, the soil cracked and pale. She could discern fresh fissures opening in the earth, thin lines radiating outwards towards the street, towards her neighbor's property line. When Richard reappeared at her porch, his countenance was somber. He explained in a low voice that the ants exhibited a ferocity exceeding any species they had previously encountered. They did not disperse under attack, but reformed, responding with an organization that unnerved even their most experienced members. Their stings, he stated, were unusually potent, capable of inducing severe reactions, even fatality. The colony itself, according to the latest radar readings, extended far beyond her property boundaries. This was not a mere infestation. It was, in his estimation, a significant biological hazard. Evelyn listened in silence, her stomach churning, her mind struggling to absorb the weight of his pronouncement. A biological hazard. She thought of her garden, once her sanctuary, now transformed into a battleground between humanity and something ancient, implacable, and alien in its unity. She considered her neighbors, oblivious to the menace creeping beneath their feet. And she thought of her own home, standing precariously above a force vast enough to engulf it entirely, That evening, as the sun once again dipped below the cypress trees and the officials made preparations for another night of containment, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, gazing at the trembling water in a glass on the table before her. The vibrations never ceased. They pulsed through her walls, her floors, her very being, and she understood with a dreadful clarity that her life, once so ordinary, so rich with the simple pleasures of earth and seed, had been consumed by something beyond her comprehension. The peril beneath her yard was no longer concealed. It was now exposed, terrifying in its magnitude, undeniable in its power, and it would not rest until it had annihilated everything in its path. Everything. The following morning, the longest night of her existence began not with the cheerful chirping of birds or the comforting drone of cicadas, but with the shrill whine of heavy machinery entering the street. Evelyn had not slept at all. She had remained seated in her armchair, her eyes fixed on the window where floodlights had blazed throughout the night, transforming her once verdant garden into a ghastly stage for the nocturnal struggle waged by uniformed individuals against the living tide beneath her soil. Her dog had curled at her feet, his body shaking with every subterranean tremor, his eyes wide and filled with apprehension. The vibration remained constant, pulsing through the house like the heartbeat of something immense, unseen, yet perpetually present. As she rose to draw back the curtains, she beheld a scene that evoked both dread and disbelief. Enormous vehicles had arrived, carrying colossal steel containers and lengthy hoses that snaked across her yard. A team of individuals in protective suits moved with swift purpose, their boots sinking into the soft, ravaged earth. At the epicenter of the activity stood the mounds, swollen and cracked from the night's unsuccessful containment efforts. Their bulk was now so immense that they resembled strange geological formations rather than mere nests, unnatural hills incongruous with her garden setting. Even marked by chemicals and scorched by fire, they endured, vibrating subtly, as if something within resisted with unyielding strength. Richard appeared once more on her porch, his face etched with exhaustion. He held a clipboard but barely glanced at it as he spoke. His words were measured, yet carried an unmistakable finality. They had resolved to inundate the subterranean network with concrete. It was, he explained, the sole method to prevent the colony from propagating uncontrollably. Poison had proven ineffective, fire had failed. Even high-pressure chemical treatments had done little more than incite the insects into frenzied waves. The colony's sheer scale, its unnatural cohesion, its terrifying adaptability, none of it could be managed by conventional means. The tunnels extended too far, the numbers were too vast. Concrete, poured in immense quantities, would solidify within the channels and chambers, immuring the swarm and extinguishing its life beneath a stone entombment. Evelyn listened in silence, her mouth dry, her throat constricted. She could only nod, though the mental image caused her stomach to clench. To encase an infestation in concrete was not pest eradication. It was internment. Yet, even with her limited knowledge, she understood its necessity. Nothing else would hold back what resided beneath her yard. Nothing else could withstand the spectacle of those countless millions acting as a single entity. The undertaking commenced immediately. Trucks positioned themselves along the driveway, their engines causing the windows to rattle. Men hauled the hoses towards the largest mound, securing the nozzles with robust stakes. When the pumps roared to life, the ground shuddered with a new intensity. A thick gray slurry descended into the earth, flowing through the fissures and cracks, vanishing into the hidden labyrinth below. Evelyn gripped the window frame with both hands, observing the scene unfold. Initially, the soil appeared to resist, the mounds vibrating violently as the ants erupted once more in furious surges, swarming up the hoses and over the workers' protective boots. Men shouted, stomped, and sprayed, maintaining their positions while the concrete poured relentlessly downwards. The air filled with the acrid scent of chemical repellents, mingled with the faint hiss of millions of tiny bodies shifting in their rage. The swarms surged, retreated, and surged again. It was akin to witnessing a tide battering a seawall, desperate to breach it. But slowly, agonizingly, the tide began to ebb. The slurry filled the tunnels, hardening as it spread. The fissures in the mounds grew still. The vibrations gradually faded. After hours of unremitting pouring, the seething movement diminished. By late afternoon, a profound silence descended upon the garden for the first time in weeks. Evelyn stood by the glass long after the pumps were silenced, gazing at the hardened forms that had once been mounds of shifting earth. They were no longer alive with tremors, no longer disgorging rivers of insects. They stood motionless, fossilized under the immense weight of tons of concrete. The workers moved cautiously amongst them, tapping the surfaces, testing their solidity. There were no further eruptions, no residual vibrations. The living entity had been permanently confined. In the ensuing days, the yard underwent a complete transformation. Crews returned with excavators, meticulously digging around the solidified masses. The ground yielded under their machinery, revealing extraordinary subterranean structures. Evelyn watched from her porch as the first of the massive concrete casts was lifted from the soil. What emerged resembled a sculpture of alien design, vast chambers frozen in stone, tunnels twisting like intricate veins, complex networks branching in patterns too intricate for human minds to conceive. The workers and scientists stood in stunned silence, their voices hushed as if they had unearthed an ancient edifice. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Within a week, news vans lined the narrow street, their satellite dishes aimed skyward. Reporters clustered at the perimeter of her property, their voices breathless as they reported on one of the largest fire ant colonies ever documented. Photographs of the casts appeared online, showcasing the staggering complexity of the underground fortress that had lain hidden beneath her unassuming garden. Evelyn's name was whispered in headlines, her story recounted in brief segments that cast her as a mere observer in her own life. They stated that she had detected the threat. They claimed her appeal for assistance had led to a monumental scientific revelation. However, they made no mention of the sleepless nights spent listening to the earth breathe, nor the way fear had become a deep-seated ailment within her. Scientists from various universities arrived, their voices laced with awe as they described the colony. Some marveled at its sheer magnitude, others at the evolutionary ingenuity of its organization. They meticulously preserved the casts, sectioning them for exhibition in laboratories and museums. A portion of the largest chamber was transported intact to a facility in Baton Rouge, where it would be studied as both a natural marvel and a cautionary tale. Evelyn heard them refer to it as a monument, an extraordinary testament to the power of collective existence. But for her, it was a tombstone, a marker for the entity that had stolen her peace and infiltrated her home. Her garden was lost, the soil was scarred, the plants destroyed, and the air heavy with the lingering scent of chemicals and machinery. The house remained, but it no longer felt like her own. At night she would sit by the window and gaze at the hardened forms that persisted, the concrete protrusions rising like ancient relics. She attempted to perceive the silence as security, but her ears still echoed with phantom vibrations. Her body still tensed, anticipating the tremors that had once rattled her dishes and disrupted her sleep. She frequently dreamt of the swarm, visions of innumerable bodies moving in unison, of the ground collapsing beneath her feet, of being swallowed whole into darkness. Neighbors began discussing selling their properties and relocating. Some attributed blame to her for drawing attention to the issue, despite her sole objective being self-preservation. Others expressed gratitude, suggesting that authorities might have remained unaware without her persistent efforts. Evelyn listened to them, feeling increasingly detached, as if her life had become a narrative recounted by others, a spectacle replayed on the evening news. She no longer recognized her quiet days, her peaceful gardening, or her evenings spent humming softly as she tended to her tomatoes. That existence had vanished. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in deep indigo and the air grew still, she stepped onto her porch with her dog at her side. The yard lay before her, barren and alien, scarred by the excavation, dominated by the fossilized remains of the mounds. She observed them in silence for an extended period, her chest feeling tight. They would remain there for years, perhaps eternally, testaments to what had lived and thrived. People would come to study them, to admire their intricate design, to speak with reverence of the prowess of nature's architects. But only she would recall the sensation of the ground trembling with their restless hunger, of standing alone in her kitchen, fear pressing against her ribs like a vice. Her existence had been irrevocably altered by the phenomenon. She was no longer simply a woman with a garden in Louisiana. She was a woman whose yard had revealed a hidden world, a sanctuary consumed by a colony of fire and fury. And as she stood there in the fading light, the cicadas silent, the air thick and expectant, she felt a chilling certainty settle deep within her. Although the ground was now quiet, although the threat was contained and under study, she would forever wonder what else might stir beneath, hidden, patient, awaiting its opportune moment to resurface.